Just before we get into it, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Thank you. Hello lads, ladies, gents, ladetts, whoever, whatever, welcome back to another video. Today I wanted to discuss Simpsons Road Rage, a game that is akin to being the older sibling that everyone seems to forget about when its younger brother Hit and Run is around. This is not to say that Hit and Run isn't good, I actually still think Hit and Run is amazing. I think in hindsight, Road Rage is better than you might think. Developed by Radical Entertainment, who are also behind Hit and Run, as well as the prototype games and that oddly amazing Hulk game from 2003. Although still technically active after being acquired by Activision in 2008, Radical Entertainment has basically been a shell of its former self. I'm not saying that Activision Blizzard can suck a dick, but if you know, you know. And this makes things really frustrating because as a development studio, they started off pretty weak, creating such awful titles as Mario is Missing, Mario's Time Machine, Independence Day, and by the turn of the century, they started to sort of get it together. They started creating some classics such as Simpsons Road Rage, Tetris World, Crash Tag Team Racing, both prototype games, only to then be stuck as a support team for the original Destiny. However, before we continue and get into anything else, we need to address the elephant in the room. Yes, at its core, this is a Crazy Taxi clone. I wanted to get this out of the way now because it's going to be very obvious as we go. Would you argue that it's better than Crazy Taxi? Probably not, to be honest. Mainly due to personality difference between both games, I think Crazy Taxi shines a lot more than what Road Rage does, but it's not to say Road Rage doesn't have its charm. Especially if you are a hardcore fan of The Simpsons, it's definitely worth at least playing once. However, the Simpsons setting didn't stop the owners of the Crazy Taxi franchise, Sega, from filing a lawsuit against Fox Interactive, EA, and Radical Entertainment, claiming that, and I quote, Road Rage was a patent infringement of the former as both games feature nearly identical gameplay and objectives with the Crazy Taxi game engine. Now, I think this is something that's actually quite interesting in terms of having a discussion about, because there are certain games that use the same core mechanics as others. Just as an example, you could have something like Uncharted, Horizon, and Assassin's Creed all kind of in the same boat, as they have that kind of parkour climbing system that's pretty similar across all three. Now, this isn't a one-to-one apples comparison in terms of Crazy Taxi to Simpsons Road Rage, as they are a lot more similar than what those three examples are. However, I wanted to use it as an example because at what point can a game own mechanics? It reminds me in terms of a real-world parallel when it comes to the company Monster Energy, who are trying to sue people for using the term monster within the title of a game. At what point do you own a word that is just commonly used? I don't think you can, just like I don't think you should have the right to own a mechanic within a game. Because if you're allowed to own a mechanic in a game, I don't think we would ever have innovation within the space. The first FPS, the first action game, the first adventure game, fighting game, racing game would basically be the pinnacle, as anyone who would attempt to improve it would probably get sued to hell, or at least would have to pay ridiculous royalties. Now, I've said my piece on it. If you have an opinion on this, let me know in the comments below, because I think it's an interesting discussion and honestly curious to see how people feel, because again, at what point can you own a word, can you own a game mechanic, can you own a theme? I don't think there is any way that would be fair within the space. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to that lawsuit, we don't know the entire outcome. All we know is that it will settle out of court for an undisclosed amount. Now, with that out the way, let's talk about the game itself. Releasing in late 2001, Road Rage came out on PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, and even the Game Boy Advance. Although all the major consoles had pretty much the same release date within a couple of months of each other, the Game Boy Advance one, however, does stand out, as it was released roughly 2 years later in mid-2003. Critically, all the ports scored about the same, with the exception of the Game Boy Advance being considered the worst, whilst the GameCube was considered the best. This is kind of ironic, as the Game Boy Advance sold really well while the GameCube did not sell very well, both console and game. In terms of the game, the home console versions are pretty much all functionally the same, with some minor bug differences and collision issues between them being a little bit different, whilst the Game Boy Advance does stand out and is pretty interesting for what it is. But more on that later. In total, the game sold just over 6 million copies across all of its platforms, with the PlayStation 2 being its best platform for sales. Now, I'm about to talk about the plot, so usually I would give a spoiler warning here, even though I'm not really going to give one, even though I am, without meaning to, but look, whatever. I won't dedicate a whole lot of time to the plot, as it's fairly simple and nothing to write home about. I was saying Burns. Upon tuning into a news broadcast with Kent Brockman, we find out that Mr. Burns has replaced all the buses within the city with what is known as Burns' Atomic Mega Bus. Claiming for it to be safe, Hans Moleman, with whom you are totally gay for, takes the lift only to exit the bus radiating a nuclear glow, stating, "Please kill me. You and me both, bud." After Lisa mentions that the buses are dangerous, Homer gets the idea to start his own taxi service, which is weird considering taxis already exist, and it's pretty much kind of like the idea of Uber Uber before we even had it, which is pretty cool. And before The Simpsons did it first meme. We then learn we need to raise $1 million in order to buy the buses back, thus saving the city. And that's essentially it. There is no giant overarching story, nothing crazy, no twists and turns and incredible things happening. It's pretty much a game that's really about the gameplay, which might explain why I love it so much. So for me personally, I think this is a strength of the game, since I always find it hard to add a good story to a game that is essentially a racing game. It's not to say that racing games can't have a good story, but for what it's worth, most of them either tend to be very cheesy or over-the-top actiony, such as like your Need for Speed Undergrounds and such. If you know a good racing game with a good story, please let me know below, because personally, I can't really think of one. This essentially establishes that gameplay is the main focus of this game. At its core, as I said earlier, Simpsons Road Rage is Crazy Taxi. It consists of 3 main modes: Road Rage, Sunday Drive, and missions. The majority of your time will be spent playing the Road Rage mode, however. It is an arcadey feeling romp through the fictional town of Springfield, as we get to explore it like we've never had before, at least up to this point. Although hit and run Springfield this is not, I don't find the map to be too offensive, but it can look a little ugly in certain locations, and it can be a little bit barren. But this is done in order to kind of make the core gameplay work, considering that you do have to travel from A to B, and if the locations are too close together, there won't be any real challenge. The core gameplay consists of picking up passengers and getting them to their desired locations as quickly as possible. Occasionally you'll be given a secondary mission. These can include avoid traffic accidents, which I'm not very good at, but I finally, during the recording of the footage for this, actually managed to do it, which I'm very proud of, or destroy as many things as possible. The money you earn carries over every round, building up to that $1 million total that you need to achieve. Upon hitting certain thresholds, we then unlock new characters or locations that we can then go to. With a total of 6 maps and 16 characters to play, with 1 extra character being unlocked via cheat code, the game seems to have a lot to offer. But this is where it might split some of you out there, as you will either love it or hate it. As in the early days, at least for me, I found I was only earning between 5 to 10 Ks for most runs, as I was learning the mechanics and getting used to the map. This can make it feel really grind heavy at the start, but if you like me and love the gameplay, as it is quite responsive and pretty snappy for what it is, not perfect, but pretty good, you'll be fine, especially if you're a Simpsons fan. Now granted, there isn't enough Simpsons content here, I think, for a diehard fan to be in love with this game forever, but there's enough little Easter eggs and things like that to kind of get that little bit of joy out of it. One problem I do have though with the Simpsons references is the fact that the voice lines, although very well voice acted, as they are done by the original cast, are very few and far between. You'll hear the same lines over and over again, thus making unlocking the characters kind of essential to not lose your mind. But this is also a strength. Although yes, the voice lines can get a little bit draining, being able to unlock all the different characters and getting to see some of the side characters get a little bit of time in the spotlight, especially someone like, say, Professor Frink, who is a personal favorite of mine, is really, really nice. And the variety, especially in an early 2000s game, is very much appreciated. The next real game mode you'll put any time into is the mission mode. There aren't that many here, but it does add a nice little simple distraction to the normal loop of the gameplay from the Road Rage mode. You'll get a different character every time and have to complete a challenge that is given to you within that set amount of time. Typically it's hit or find X thing in X amount of time. They aren't overly challenging, but they can add a nice little distraction, especially, as I said, to break up that original gameplay loop. Although it could have been a mode on its own, I think in the missions mode we should have had something to do with races. I think racing would have helped players learn the maps a little bit more and give them more incentive to try and unlock the maps instead of characters. Because personally, I found myself always picking characters instead of maps, because as I learned to map, I get better at it. This would then make grinding less of a challenge, as I would just easily make more money each and every run. But beyond that, I think missions do their job in being a nice little distraction from that core gameplay loop. Beyond that, we do have that Sunday Drive mode, which is basically just a sandbox mode where we drive around, we can learn the maps that way. However, I don't really enjoy this mode as it's a whole lot of nothing. Now, I don't want it to seem like I'm being too negative up to this point, but I can understand people's complaints when they say this game is kind of limited in terms of its game modes. This is a symptom of games of this era though, so I do take that with a pinch of salt. If you go in expecting fun gameplay, a little bit of silliness, you're going to have a good time. If you go in expecting a perfect arcade experience, something like your Crazy Taxi, I don't think you're going to have fun. As I said earlier, why would you pick Simpsons Road Rage over Crazy Taxi when they are essentially the same game? Now, typically towards the end, I would like to talk about the sound design or the music, but there isn't much to talk about with Road Rage. It's all pretty standard, with nothing being exceptional and nothing being particularly bad. As mentioned, the voice lines are very well voice acted. Do keep in mind, you will hear them over and over again if you do plan on finishing this game. So instead, I wanted to actually talk about the Game Boy Advance port. A little bit of a weird transition, I know. I think it deserves its own little section here, because it's quite strange. It's very impressive for what it is. The whole thing runs in Mode 7. Those who don't know, Mode 7 was technology used on the original Super Nintendo. They used it for the original Super Mario Kart. Here, it works pretty well and the frame rate's smooth enough. Although, the map isn't particularly great and you can get lost pretty easy. Once you've played it enough, I think you'll figure it out and you won't have too many troubles. So, would I recommend the Game Boy Advance port? Not necessarily over the console port, but if you are a diehard Simpsons fan and you've already beat Road Rage and you're like, I kind of want to experience it again, but I don't. If you haven't played the Game Boy Advance port, give it a go. So with that, lads, ladies, gents, ladetts, whoever, whatever, thank you so much for watching this video on Simpsons Road Rage. I don't think I was overly positive, even though I really enjoy the game, so, you know, yeah, great writing. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I apologize for the delay for this video. Life happens. I made a community post about it if you want more information, and yeah, hopefully we can get the ball back rolling. Thank you so much. Stay safe out there. Bye.